right, well, as we continue our consideration of heroes of the church, as we remember last week, what we decided to do, what we wanted to do, was to discuss more about some of the contributions which came from Thomas Aquinas, which came specifically even more so into the Protestant churches. As we discussed last week, there's somewhat of an antipathy with certain Protestants as it relates to Thomas Aquinas, and we'll get into at least one of those, but I think I overpromised. Within the time constraints that we have, I mean, we're not going to be able to consider everything that I really wanted to consider. So specifically, Kant's repudiation of Thomas's classical synthesis, God willing, we might have some time in another date to go into further detail. Now, with Thomas Aquinas, as we discussed, he was a brilliant thinker. He had a brilliant mind. And again, he only lived to the age of 49 years old and contributed very much to the church. I mean, Thomas Aquinas' Thomism can be a study in and of itself. So we are going to peruse, give a general overview about one certain teaching that he did give that causes some of this consternation. Again, in particular in Protestant circles, but not in Protestant circles alone. For example, Francis Schaeffer, the late Francis Schaeffer, who died in 1984, was a great theologian, was a great philosopher. But one of the things he would say, really in lamenting the condition and the state of the church, and even more so in the world. And if you've ever come across Francis Schaeffer, much of his teachings, especially again with his concern as it relates to the state of the church and the world, many of his words have proven to be prophetic. However, one has not, and really when he was lamenting the state of the church and the state of the world, and specifically as it relates to relativism, he laid much of the blame on Thomas Aquinas, suggesting what Thomas Aquinas did, and this is some of the antagonism that Protestants have with Thomas Aquinas, that they suggest that what Thomas Aquinas did was separate nature and grace. Okay, these two things, which we will get into more detail. But what we want to do, in order to understand a person's teaching, in order to understand any kind of teaching, any kind of doctrines, any kind of, in particular theology, when we're studying theology, when we're studying philosophy, when we're studying science, what a prudent thing to do is to go back to these men or women and see what they were dealing with. Okay, so in Thomas's day, in the 13th century, most of the Western world will attribute the Renaissance as beginning in the West, in Florence, where in reality, the ancients in the East were already going back to the classical works. So in the Arab nations specifically, particularly with two Muslim theologians by the name of Averroes and Avicenna, I can't pronounce these names sometimes, but Averroes and Avicenna taught much. But what they were doing was syncretizing or integrating Aristotelianism into Muslim theology, which developed what is called integral Aristotelianism. Okay, that sounds very complicated. And again, that's a study in and of itself. But one thing that emerged out of this is what's called the double truth theory. Essentially, what they would say, if we can kind of, what they would say though, is that certain things can be true in philosophy and false in theology, or it can be true in science and false in theology, or it can be true in theology and false in science, or it can be true in theology and false in philosophy. And if we can, another good way of illustrating this is to bring this into our modern day. And so what this might look like is a Christian, on Monday will be, so we all know, for example, the theory of evolution, specifically microevolution, where mankind was generated from this slow, progressive deal. And essentially, we are just grown-up germs, cosmic accidents coming from the primordial slime and so forth, and that's from whence we came. Or are we beings made and created by the providence of an eternal being? These two things can't be reconciled. You either believe we are products of the primordial dust or slime, or we are products of the providence of a good God. Okay, these things can't be reconciled. So, in our day, this would look like a Christian on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays believing in microevolution, right? And then Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, they'll believe in creation. And then on Sunday, they'll rest. Okay, but so on these specific days, they are evolutionists, and then on these other days, they are theists. And
please try again.
Okay, apologies, Siri interrupted. So essentially, what this is in our modern day is relativism. So it's essential for us to recognize at the outset of this brief overview that what Thomas Aquinas was dealing with is the same problem we're dealing with. Okay, so what he essentially said was that there are certain truths we can learn through nature, okay, through the cosmos, through the things that are made. And then there are certain truths we can find only in the Bible. In other words, through nature. You can go into a laboratory and study, the circular motion of the body, molecular biology, and so forth, which you can read the Bible until you're blue in the face all your life. You will never learn of the circular motion of the bloodstream and the molecular biology and all sorts of different kinds of sciences. You cannot find this in the Bible. Conversely, you can see all of the nature you want. Go into the ends of the earth, go to the most remote parts of the universe, and you will never find God's plan of redemption. That is only found in the Bible. So, what he said was, in one case, there are two modes of knowledge. Okay, there are two ways of acquiring knowledge. Is what Thomas is getting at here. You have in nature. From nature, you have knowledge you can only glean from nature. You can read the Bible all you want, and you will not find these certain truths that come from nature. Conversely, again, on the other hand, this other mode of knowledge, scriptures, special revelation, you can only find in the scriptures. You cannot find in nature. Okay? So far, so good. He developed a third principle, which what he called articulus mixtus, because he wrote in Latin. In English, these are the mixed articles, and this is kind of where some of the controversy starts to kind of develop. What the mixed articles were and are, and still remains to be true, is that there are certain truths we can find both in nature and in the Bible. The easiest ones we can see is found in Romans 1, and when the psalmist declares the glory of God in the things that are made, in the stars and the heavens, declare the glory of God, and the earth is handiwork. So we can study, we can see, we can find God's existence in nature, and specifically, Paul in Romans says this is inescapable. This knowledge gets to mankind, particularly his existence, but also his moral framework for mankind. Everybody has the truths of God in their minds and in their hearts, being made in the image of God and so forth. But what we do is suppress it. Okay, but we will get, very briefly, but we will get to that somewhat shortly. So, again, these are the mixed articles. What he was doing here was distinguishing. What he was doing here was distinguishing nature and grace. And you've all been around for long enough. One of the things I try to repeat is one of the most important things you can learn in theology and in philosophy and in science, and any kind of science, is the difference between, or the distinction between a distinction and a separation. Good example is, if I distinguish your body from your soul, I do no harm to you. If I separate your body from your soul, I've killed you. So there's all the difference in the world between a distinction and a separation. What he was doing, he was distinguishing these two. So there are certain truths you can only find in nature and not in the Bible. There are certain truths you can only find in the Bible and not in nature. However, there are certain truths you can find both in nature and in the Bible. Okay? Maybe these terms are somewhat unfortunate that he uses nature and grace, and this could kind of lead to some of the confusion. However, what he's talking about here as it relates to nature is what we discuss regarding general revelation, the differences of general revelation and special revelation, but in particular, general revelation. Remember, there are two modes in which this is done. Immediate, so that's without any mediums. This is directly put into us, the conscience and so forth, and the heart, and all these kinds of different things. But this is internal, this is immediate. It doesn't mean quickly, that kind of a thing. It just means without a medium. Okay? Mediate is to use certain mediums, like, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth is handiwork. So that's mediate. That's using, just like we use the term media for certain social media, for certain different kinds of media, news media, and so forth. There are these different mediums of media, okay? And that's essentially what he was saying, what he was getting at with general revelation. There are certain things that we can find in general revelation, again, through either immediate or immediately by God, and there are certain truths that will not contradict that we can also find in the Bible. What he was saying, what he was emphasizing, is that there will never be a time, again, there are certain times where you can only find certain truths in nature. There are times and there are certain things, certain truths you can only find in the Bible. But with his mixed articles, the Bible will never contradict science, and science will never contradict the Bible. The Bible will never contradict true, honest philosophy and true, honest science, and true philosophy will never contradict the Bible. Well, essentially, just like Augustine had said, Augustine he implored his students, he implored people in general, in his writings and so forth, for the Christian to learn as much as he can in his lifetime, as much as he can in all the different, in theology, in philosophy, in science, whatever, because ultimately all truth is God's truth. All truth, no matter where it begins, it finds its way. It leads to the top. All truth comes from God. So, in addition to this, part of this though, with the general revelation, right, is there, beyond God's existence, and even that though, but is there, through this general revelation, is there enough knowledge, is there any knowledge we can glean from nature about God? In other words, is there any such thing as natural theology? And this is kind of the problem that some people have with Thomas Aquinas, that he suggests that there is a certain theology that can be found in nature. In other words, one of the biggest bugaboos people have with Thomas Aquinas is with his 5 ways and with his 5 proofs for the existence of God, which we'll get to here in a second. Ultimately, this just gives us Aristotle's first cause. And many Christians will lament that God, the God of the Bible, God as he truly is far greater than the uncaused first cause. And it's essential that we grant that's true. It's absolutely true. He is far greater than just the uncaused first cause, but he is not less than the uncaused first cause. And if we just surrender to the secularists, the secularists are determined to destroy
the creation of God, if you can take away creation, you take away all of theism. I mean, technically, at least the monotheisms of this world, all of them are dead in the water if you take away God's creation, God's created order and so forth. So, if whatever knowledge we can glean from nature, technically, by definition, is natural theology, because the word theology just means the knowledge of God, or a knowledge of God. So we can glean certain things just from nature. Again, merely his existence. But even the Bible says we can also see his glory and see his handiwork. We can see some of his purposive acts in creation, in his created world, in the things that are made, which Paul got into. Now, going into his 5 proofs, or his 5 ways, what I want to pinpoint on is technically the third one, is necessary being. Okay, what he was getting to here is that there must be a being who has the power of being in and of himself. He's not self-created; he is self-existent. If there is no such being, then there's no possibility that anything could possibly be now. To put it another way, if there ever was a time there was nothing, what could there possibly be now other than nothing? Now, part of the confusion that comes into this necessary being, that is because we can define this necessity 2 different ways. Okay, one is logical necessity. We just, through our rationale, through our reason, we can see that what you end up with in this mode of self-creation ad infinitum is what's called an infinite regress, which is logically absurd. Now, not everybody will just acquiesce to that and say that's logically absurd. For example, Bertrand Russell, when he was publicly debating Frederick Copplestone made it obvious that that the infinite regress is logically absurd and it's inconceivable. And Bertrand Russell said, no, well, that's not true. I can conceive it. Now, the problem that you have with the infinite regress, especially as it relates to what he was suggesting, is not only do you have the nonsense of self-creation, as we've discussed in our, essentially, to be self-created, you would have to be and not be at the same time in the same relationship. It is logically absurd. Self-creation just in and of itself is absurd. However, the additional problem you have with an infinite regress is not only do you have an absurdity for a short period of time, a brief absurdity, but you have an infinite absurdity, where this absurdity has no end, it just trickles down to more and more absurdity. However, but this necessary being is both logical, because again, you can reason from the things that are made, and from reason itself. Again, if there was ever nothing, or if there ever was a time that there was nothing, then there would still be nothing. Now, in addition to this, he is also ontologically necessary. This is a necessity out of being. In other words, this being who's got the attribute of aseity, he's self-existence. He has the power of existence in and of himself. If there were no such being, there would be nothing now, because this is how you end up in the infinite regress, where there has to be this being with the power of being in and of himself. There has to be one being who is not contingent or derived. We all know, we as beings, I am not a necessary being, right? None of us are a necessary being. We can all conceive of my never having existed. You know, James Meyers III is not a necessary being. I am contingent, I am derived. But there must be a being who has the power of being in and of himself, who is not contingent or derived. In other words, he's necessary, eternal. There's no possible way for this being to not be. And again, from this being comes all of the other contingent and derived things and beings.
Okay, so he's necessary logically and ontologically. Again, so let's take his nature and grace, and his articulus mixtus and so forth, and see where he's going with all this. Okay, with this little brief overview, and these are recorded, so if you need to take them up again, or if we need to discuss this further, then that's fine. I mean, we'll have a question and answer session after this. However, in addition to this, because this being is a supreme being, this being is the only one who has the power of being in and of himself. Okay? Now, briefly, what I do, because I did promise, and I'm going to have to fly through this, unfortunately, but remember, as one of the things I thought was outstanding with Thomas Aquinas was when he was young, he asked, what is God? Not who is God, and not some of the other profound questions you can find in children. But what is God? In other words, what is his nature? How can we define God? And the problem you have in defining an eternal being, an infinite being, is that you put a finitude on this being. You are definituding it. Okay? You are essentially attributing finitude to a being who is infinite and eternal. So we're stuck with certain, that's why we call him eternal. We're somewhat limited in our capacity to to exhaustively describe him. We do have these certain terms that give us an idea of who he is. So, in addition to this, what Thomas Aquinas developed was the analogia entis, the analogy of being. If we can remember in our series regarding apologetics when we were talking about the analogy of language, but we did get into the analogy of being. And what he's saying is there has to be there is a similarity. The difference between God's being and our being is being. Again, he is not contingent, he is not derived, he has the power of existence in and of himself. We are contingent, we are derived. So that's one of the differences, but the difference of being between the supreme being and human beings is being. However, there's enough similarity. Again, being made in the image of God, there's enough similarity. There's an analogy of being to, again, not enough. We are not so similar that we can exhaustively describe him or exhaustively even know him. He is eternal. He is infinite. He is omnipotent. He is omniscient. So we are limited by nature. However, we do have this analogy of being. We do have this line to know the things of God simply for the mere fact that we are made in his image and our beings are close enough, analogous to each other, to where, again, we can't know him exhaustively, but we can know him enough to discuss him rationally, truthfully, to where we can distinguish between truth and falsehood as well. This analogy gives us that amount of truth, that capacity to either, again, in general revelation or special revelation. This analogy of being gives us the truth by which, like Thomas Aquinas, demolished this double truth nonsense, just as we must demolish this relative nonsense that all truth is relative, and that statement itself is an absolute statement. And this whole idea, there are no such things, there are no absolutes, as an absolute statement. It's self-contradictory. It's nonsense, and it should be articulated as such. It's just nonsense. However, he was dealing with the same thing, and because we have this analogy of being, he knew that's nonsense. Same thing in theology, where, as we've discussed, many of the heresies in the ancient church, where we have this analogy of being, and we have his special revelation. We can take his special revelation, we can take our analogy of being, and find the truth of who Jesus Christ was, his nature, and so forth. Again, not exhaustively, but enough to demolish nonsense, heresies, falsehoods that that demean God's sovereignty and God's glory. So we have this analogy of being, we have this link to God. Now, we don't have enough time. Man, I really hoped we would save enough time to get into some of Kant's situation, but we don't. So I'm just going to have to save that for another time. But again, it's assumed that through Kant's, if you remember Kant's noumenal world and his phenomenal world, again, the phenomenal world is the world of the senses, and the world of appearances, at which we can glean from our senses, which we can see, taste, hear, and so forth. That's the phenomenal world. And then in the noumenal world, which is beyond our scope, beyond our capacity, is the idea of God, the idea of the self, and the Ding an sich, the idea of essences, which is self-contradictory as well, to a certain extent. In my opinion, I think this is irrational, because what he's saying also, one thing we can know, apparently, is the idea of the self is that we have this unbridgeable chasm between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. Also, this idea of God exists, apparently, we can know this, the idea of God exists outside of our knowledge that there is an idea of God. It's ridiculous, and what we need to go back to is Aquinas' classical synthesis. Essentially, go back to Augustine, go back to Calvin. The idea of self is repudiated in the first chapter of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, where John Calvin is talking about the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man, or the knowledge of the self. You can't know yourself unless you know God. You can't know God unless you know yourself. The idea of God and the idea of self is a revelation that God has given over to every man and woman, to all of his created beings, to all those who he has made in his image. But again, sadly, and it is a study in and of itself. This would take much time, so kind of fortunately, I was only able to kind of throw that in there because, when you make things a little bit too brief, you leave too much ambiguity to where it's utterly confused and utterly unknowable. So hopefully we didn't run into that. So that's essentially all we have time to disclose about some of what Thomas Aquinas contributed to the church. Thomas Aquinas, with his classical synthesis, in fact, because again, he's less known in secular world and even in Protestant world as a theologian. He's very much established in Catholic theology. Okay, but he's more well known as a philosopher, as a rational thinker, and so his classical synthesis in academia, for academic integrity, they still study Thomas's classical synthesis and his arguments for the existence of God, because so proficient, so efficient was this argument that, again, for academic integrity, one must look at what Thomas contributed. He is a titan of philosophical thought, and in my opinion, he's a titan of theological thought. He did not want to separate science and theology. He did not want to separate philosophy and theology as well. And I don't think anything can be more obvious than that, because he was a philosopher, he was a theologian. So, I mean, it's antithetical to even reason, because, again, he being both of these things, it would be pretty ridiculous to assume he was trying to separate these things. However, so, this man gave much more than this, okay? It's a half an hour bird's eye view of just a few of the things that has passed down to all of the church. All of the church. And we need to be disciples of God's truth, which he has given through certain men and women, and in this instance, Thomas Aquinas, to take this out into the rest of the world. This can be part of evangelism. Part of evangelism is to show the error of another's worldview, and to also infuse, to instruct about the things of God, So part of it is removal, and then the other part is addition, filling. So, it's a bit of an extraction, and then also not an intrusion, but insertion, for lack of a better word. That's a terrible word. However, so thus concludes our consideration of Thomas Aquinas, at least in this series, until, by God's grace, we might have more time. I think this is somewhat, it gives you an idea, but I think this is sadly far too brief and doesn't really give him a fair shake of what he actually did contribute to the world, not only to the church. Now, again, I did want to open this up for questions, because this can be a bit academic and very cerebral, but please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. People say there are no such things as stupid questions, which I don't agree with, but we'll say it just to make you feel good. Are there any questions? No? We're all good? That was all sufficient? Explicable? Okay. All right. Well, praise God then. Let's pray.